Rungsat Special Zone, 1968. A Navy SEAL steps off a patrol boat onto a mud landing, and before the platoon moves out, he pulls a pair of Levi's 501s on overgear that already smells like standing water. Nobody stops him. Nobody writes it up. The Navy never issued those jeans. He bought them himself, most likely off a shelf at a base exchange, or mailed a size and a model number home 3 weeks earlier and waited for the package. The pants the military gave him for this exact terrain were, by that point in the war, understood by the men wearing them to be a liability. Not an inconvenience. A liability in the specific sense that gets men killed. Hold on to the water for a second. Not the mud, not the leeches yet. The water itself and the sound it made moving against denim compared to the sound it made dragging against stiff cotton twill. That detail sounds small right now. It isn't. Remember it. Here is what nobody sitting in an equipment testing lab in the continental United States understood in the mid-1960s. The U.S. military's entire doctrine for jungle-suitable clothing had been built out of 2 prior wars, and neither one was this one. Korea was cold, mountainous, and largely dry underfoot, a doctrine of layering and insulation. The Pacific theater of World War II involved genuine jungle, but the standard-issue solutions that emerged from it were built around dense triple-canopy forest floor, not standing water, heavy canvas, bellowed cargo pockets sized for maps and ammunition, loosely woven cotton that breathed in humidity. Every one of those design choices made sense against the terrain it was tested on. None of it had ever been tested against 400 square kilometers of tidal river, mangrove root, and mud flat sitting southeast of Saigon, where SEAL Team 1 established a presence out of Nha Be, beginning in February of 1966. The world believed jungle fatigues worked because they had been proven in jungle. Nobody had proven them in a delta, because a delta is not a jungle. It is jungle's terrain, rewritten by tide. That assumption survived for exactly as long as it took a SEAL platoon to cross its first canal in full kit. Go back further, and the gap makes even more sense. SEALs first arrived in South Vietnam in 1962 in an advisory capacity, training South Vietnamese commandos in the same methods the Americans themselves had just learned. That advisory mission grew, quietly, into direct action work, reconnaissance, ambush, and eventually, the CIA-linked Phoenix program targeting Viet Cong infrastructure directly. Every step of that escalation happened faster than the supply chain behind it could adjust. The doctrine writers back in the United States were still refining equipment specifications built for a war that had already changed shape twice by the time the paperwork caught up. That's not incompetence. That's the physical limit of how fast a bureaucracy can move relative to how fast a war on the ground evolves. The cargo pocket was engineered as a feature, not a flaw. 2 large bellowed pockets, one on each thigh, sized to carry maps, spare magazines, a radio battery, genuinely useful cargo capacity in dry terrain for a soldier who wasn't submerging himself in tidal water multiple times a day. In the Mekong Delta, that same pocket became something closer to a design failure with a body count quietly attached to it. Every canal crossing and a single patrol could involve a dozen or more, filled both pockets with water and delta silt on contact. The silt didn't drain back out through the fabric weave the way it had gone in. It sat there, against the leg, adding measurable weight to each stride, and it stayed through the entire remainder of the movement phase. In an ambush, the margin between reacting in time and reacting a half-second too late was sometimes the entire outcome of the engagement. A pocket full of standing mud is not a minor discomfort to be tolerated. It is ballast, arriving at precisely the moment a man needs his legs to move like they aren't carrying any. That's the surface-level answer, though, and it undersells the actual problem. What the original equipment testing hadn't modeled wasn't terrain in isolation. It was terrain combined with tempo. The Delta didn't ask a soldier to get wet once, climb out, and dry off before the next task. It asked him to get wet, move, make contact, extract, and repeat that cycle continuously for the length of an entire multi-month deployment, without the fabric ever fully drying between insertions. So, SEALs started buying jeans. Levi's 501s and 505s specifically. The model numbers mattered, and men who'd tried both had preferences. Purchases came through PX stores on base where available, and through mail order from home where they weren't. At some of the more remote and improvised bases in the Delta, like the pontoon-mounted Sea Float Advanced Tactical Support Position on the Song Khao Lan, Levi's simply couldn't be obtained locally at all, and operators requested them by mail months in advance. Levi Strauss & Company had no formal role in any of this. This was entirely private purchase gear, funded out of soldiers' own pockets, because the Army's equipment procurement and testing cycle operated on an institutional timeline that had no mechanism for responding to a problem discovered in the field in real time. The mechanism itself is worth sitting with in detail, because none of it is mystical. It's geometry and fabric density, full stop. Levi's are cut close to the leg. The classic five-pocket design sits flat against the body rather than ballooning outward the way a bellowed cargo pocket is built to do. When an operator climbed up out of a canal wearing denim, water sheeted off the surface almost immediately, instead of pooling inside a cavity that had been engineered to hold cargo, and now held water instead. The weave itself was tighter and considerably heavier than standard issue twill, and that density cut two ways in the operator's favor. It dried faster once out of the water because there was less surface area of loosely spaced fiber to hold moisture, and it stood up to elephant grass, the razor-edged vegetation lining most of the Delta's tree lines and canal banks, capable of shredding a jungle-fatigue trouser leg to ribbons across a single afternoon patrol, in a way that looser cotton simply couldn't withstand. Denim didn't fight the environment head-on. It refused to cooperate with the specific 2 or 3 ways the environment was trying to kill a man, and that narrow targeted refusal was the entire point. Pantyhose solved a different problem, on the same bodies, in the same terrain. The tidal swamps of the Rungsat and the wider Delta carried an aggressive population of tropical leeches, not the passive variety found in a temperate creek back home, but leeches that moved with active purpose toward warm bodies in the water, working their way through gaps at the cuff and waistband of standard trousers, and in some cases biting directly through loosely woven fabric. An operator coming out of an insertion through swamp water could find himself carrying dozens of attached leeches before he'd taken a single step on solid ground, in locations on the body that made a live patrol exactly the wrong moment to be conducting a thorough self-examination. Women's nylon hosiery, worn as an underlayer beneath the jeans, closed that gap in a way no piece of official military-issue clothing ever had. The nylon mesh was woven too tight for a leech to bite through. The surface was too smooth for one to find purchase and climb. And critically, this is the detail that made the combination work as a system rather than as 2 separate fixes. Hosiery is manufactured to seal snugly against the leg at the waistband with no gap at all, which meant the one entry point that standard trousers always left exposed, however cinched the belt, was simply engineered out of existence. Denim on the outside kept the mud from ever getting a hold on the leg. Nylon underneath kept out everything that wanted in through the seams and the waist. Some platoons went a step further, cinching rubber bands around the ankle cuffs to seal off the last remaining gap at the boot line. It reads as strange the first time you hear it. It stops being strange the moment you understand it was never a fashion choice. It was a closed system, built out of 2 civilian products that had nothing to do with each other in any commercial catalog, solving 2 separate failure modes of the same terrain. The visual result became, in its own quiet way, a kind of unofficial uniform. Operators pairing Levi's with coral-soled combat boots, and, for those who could afford one, a privately purchased dive watch built to survive far deeper water pressure than anything the Delta could produce. Because the standard-issue military watch of the era wasn't reliably waterproof, wasn't shockproof, and wasn't precise enough for operations where a 30-second timing error on a coordinated extraction could leave a platoon stranded on the wrong bank of a canal at the wrong moment. None of it was regulation. All of it was earned through the same process. Something failed in the field, and the fix arrived by mail rather than by requisition. Here's a name worth holding on to. Jim Berta, SEAL Team 1, out of the Class 44 Bud-S pipeline in Coronado, deployed to Vietnam, and returning for a second tour in 1970 and 1971 as an advisor to the Lien Doi Nguyen Nai, the LDNN, South Vietnam's own frogman unit, trained and mentored directly by American SEALs. Berta wore the jeans. He wasn't alone in his reasoning, and he put it plainly, in words that outlasted the war itself. Mosquitoes couldn't get through the denim. He and the other operators in his platoon added those rubber bands at the ankle themselves, sealing the last gap the leeches could exploit. This wasn't theory for him, and it wasn't an anecdote he was building for a future book. It was Tuesday. It was the difference between finishing a patrol clean and finishing it covered. Hold that name. There's more to what happened to him than the jeans. If this is showing you a piece of the war you haven't seen before, the kind that never made it into the official equipment histories, a like helps this reach the people who care about getting the real version of it. Not every SEAL who tried the jeans was convinced, and that split is worth sitting inside for a moment, because it's where the deeper irony of this story actually lives. Retired Captain Rick Woolard, who commanded 2 SEAL platoons in country, tried Levi's himself and came away unimpressed. He found them stiffer and less functional than a well-worn set of standard camis, at least until a new pair had been broken in through repeated wear. He didn't forbid the men under his command from wearing them. He simply filed the entire practice under what he called style points, in the same mental category as beards, bandanas, and long hair. Personal expression tolerated at the edges of a war that had bigger problems to worry about. Command tolerance, not command endorsement. Never a requisition line item. That gap between tolerance and endorsement is the deeper irony sitting underneath this entire story. The Navy never formally approved the jeans. It never approved the pantyhose. No supply requisition form exists for either in any surviving unit record. And none of that mattered in the slightest. The practice spread anyway, platoon to platoon, tour to tour, carried by word of mouth and by the simple, unimpeachable authority of men who had tried it and come back alive. Other operators customized the approach further, some sewing camouflage pocket panels salvaged from standard-issue jungle blouses directly onto the denim, engineering a hybrid garment the Army had never conceived of and would never have approved through any formal channel. An institution can withhold its stamp of approval from a piece of gear indefinitely. It cannot withhold results. Once one platoon came home from a rotation with fewer leech-related medical entries and fewer waterlogged leg incidents than the platoon operating beside it in standard issue, the argument was effectively already over. No memo required. No policy update necessary. The field made the decision the procurement office never got around to making. Remember the water sound from the very beginning of this. Denim moving through water is measurably quieter than stiff, wet cotton twill dragging against itself with every stride, and in an environment where the first indication of an ambush was sometimes nothing more than the small sound of a boot pulling free of suction mud, that quiet carried a value that no equipment requirements document had ever thought to specify as a design goal. Nobody wrote "reduce acoustic signature in submerged movement" into a procurement spec for combat trousers. Nobody needed to. The genes delivered it anyway, as a side effect of solving an entirely different, more mundane problem. Proof that the right material choice, made for practical reasons, can pay dividends nobody was even looking for. Consider, too, that this wasn't the only place the same failure was repeating itself across the wider war. Regular infantry units in the Delta were quietly discovering their own version of the identical problem. Standard-issue cotton socks, worn inside standard-issue leather and canvas boots, absorbed water and held it directly against skin for hours at a stretch, producing a condition called immersion foot. Functionally the same injury as the trench foot that had crippled soldiers in the flooded trenches of the First World War, half a century and an ocean away, under a completely different set of doctrine writers who had apparently never spoken to each other across the decades. Infantrymen stopped writing home for care packages of food and started writing home for wool and nylon socks instead, because both materials moved moisture away from skin in a way cotton simply refused to. It's the same failure, in a different piece of gear, solved by the same informal mechanism: private purchase, word of mouth, and total institutional silence on the subject. The jeans and the pantyhose weren't an isolated curiosity. They were one visible symptom of a pattern running through the entire American war effort in that terrain. Pull the frame out further, and this stops being a story about jeans at all. It becomes a story about the permanent gap between what an institution can test for in a controlled setting and what a man actually encounters once he's standing in the terrain, the institution only modeled on paper. And it becomes a story about what happens when that gap turns lethal. The correction doesn't come from the top of the organizational chart. It comes from the bottom, assembled out of whatever happens to be sitting on a shelf at a base exchange or arriving in a care package from home, $4 and a pair of stockings at a time, moving through an informal network that no official chain of command ever mapped or authorized. The Army built its jungle doctrine in a testing facility. The Delta rewrote that doctrine in mud and leech bites, one platoon at a time, and the rewrite traveled from man to man faster than any procurement cycle in Washington was ever built to move. Berta made it home. He went on to become a journeyman ironworker in San Diego, helping raise the structures that still stand along that coastline today. The San Diego Convention Center among them, along with work on the Coronado shores. He stayed with the Naval Special Warfare Reserve, was later recognized as its top enlisted sailor out of a force of more than 150,000 personnel, and was recalled to active duty decades after Vietnam for Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. From his time in the Delta, he carried home a Bronze Star with Combat Valor device and a Purple Heart for the wounds that came with it. As a teenager, long before any of it, he'd watched a television show about a Navy frogman and decided that was going to be his life, on the condition that the Navy would let him train in Coronado. It did. He met the woman he'd spent more than 50 years married to before he ever left for training. He died this year. The Delta was one deployment inside a very long life, the part of it that taught him what a pair of jeans and a rubber band could do, that a government contract couldn't, before he came home and spent the rest of that life building things that are still standing. If you know this history, if you served in the Delta yourself, or you had family who did, and you're carrying a field fix that never made it into any official manual, leave it in the comments below. This particular record deserves to be complete, and it's not going to be completed by anyone in a procurement office. And if you're the kind of person who came looking for this video because you already suspected there was more to this war than the version taught out of a textbook, you're exactly who this channel exists for. Subscribe for more of it. Thank you for watching.